I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. And so what's on tap for today, you might ask? Well, pollinators are, and we are going to have Stephen Rogers. He's the recreation manager for the Lexington-Fayette Urban County Government and the park naturalist from McConnell Springs. And he's going to be discussing the vital roles of pollinators and a healthy ecosystem. And then we also have Kai Davis back again to talk about bird calls. He's a grad student in the Department of Forestry, and we had a lot of people that are interested in him being on. And so we have asked him to join us again. And then to wrap up this week's show, we have Susan Fox. She is an A&R extension agent for Lyon County, and she will actually be talking about the native plants that you could put in your landscapes to attract the pollinators that Stephen Rogers is going to tell you about. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So Stephen, if you could go ahead and pull up your camera, please. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you being on, and explain to us a little bit about what your presentation is going to be about.
So I'm going to be talking about pollinators, what we do with Lexington Parks and Recreation to support pollinator habitat within our existing parklands. A program that we're involved with called the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. That's a citywide program that we're kind of spearheading the initiative there, and tell you a little bit about other programs and projects that we have going on within our parks and recreation in Lexington to support pollinators.
All right, wonderful. Looking forward to it.
So I'm with Lexington Parks and Recreation. I'll tell you a little bit about my agency if you're not familiar. So of course, we're located in Lexington. We have about 100 parks locations within Lexington, Fayette County. We're a merged urban county government, so we're all kind of together. And all of these parks are spread out across the county. These include natural areas, these include golf courses, community centers, and a variety of other locations. We have a few natural areas within those, McConnell Springs being one of those. That's the park that I manage directly. And within those existing parks, we have a few different areas that we've started to focus on to create pollinator habitat. I've been with Lexington Parks and Recreation for about 8 years now. I'm a certified environmental educator through the Kentucky Environmental Education Council. We do a lot of environmental education programming with students at my location and at other locations throughout the city. And so one of our goals is to do programming like this, like a lot of you guys probably do, to educate people about the environment and the resources that they have in their backyard. So today I want to talk to you about pollinators. It's a topic that most of us probably know quite a bit about. We kind of know the term. It's a hot thing right now to discuss monarch butterflies and discuss other pollinators. A lot of people in the general public may not fully understand how many different pollinators there are, why pollinators are so important for us, and what they can do at their home to protect them. So I'm really excited to hear about the other presentation about native plants and how people can incorporate them into their landscaping. So what are pollinators? They're any animal that carries pollen from one flower to another. And what's cool about that is they don't know that they're doing that all the time. They're just kind of living their life. They're going out collecting pollen, collecting nectar from flower to flower. In some cases, collecting insects near flowers or collecting seeds from other flowers. And they're helping move pollen from flower to flower, thus creating the seeds that that plant needs to survive. So it's an adaptation that the plant has had over time to allow themselves to grow next to those plants or next to those animals, and the animals have found ways to find their food in and around those plants. So pollinators include birds, bats, and a variety of insects. That's when we're talking about pollinators, we're talking about those animals. Insects pollinate around 75% of all flowers, which is really kind of an important thing to think about. If you think about all the flowers that are out in the world, every flowering plant, some of them do use wind to pollinate, but most of them are pollinated by our insects. And there are 4 major groups of insects that pollinate. It's bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, and moths, and beetles. First, one of our first pollinators I want to talk about is the monarch butterfly. Monarch butterfly is kind of the poster child for what's going on with our pollinator community, because we get a chance to see the monarch butterfly population congregated together annually. And so we can monitor all of our monarch butterflies in a few centralized locations in Mexico and in Southern California when they nest in the wintertime. So it's a migrating species. They've started to come back into Kentucky. I've seen a few so far. So they migrate from as far north from Canada all the way through the continental US down to Mexico and parts of Southern California, where they will migrate and congregate in the wintertime in a few select locations. And once they breed in those locations, then that brood will move back north. So I always, when I'm explaining monarch butterfly migration to children, I always tell them that if you're the monarch butterfly that's born at the end of the summertime, then you've got the longest life cycle. You get the opportunity to really get out and explore more. If you're born at the beginning of summer, then your life cycle is going to be significantly shorter. So the monarch butterflies that are flying back to Kentucky or through Kentucky right now, they've been alive since last fall when they emerged from their chrysalis, and they made the migration south, and now they've made the migration back north. And so those butterflies are looking for food right now. They're going to be looking for milkweed, which is the host plant for monarch butterfly caterpillars, which is that guy right there. So the monarch butterfly caterpillar will be hatching out of eggs soon. So the first brood will be laid soon. And then this brood will survive during the summer. They'll grow, they'll develop into butterflies, and then they'll lay eggs towards the end of the summer on those milkweed plants again. Milkweed is the host plant for monarch caterpillars. And it's a really interesting relationship that they have with milkweed, because the milkweed actually makes them a toxic food source for other animals. So the striping that's on the caterpillar is actually a warning sign to other bird or other predators that could be coming along to eat the caterpillars. So a bird or any other animal, they're going to identify that as a warning sign. These caterpillars are toxic. So as they're growing on the milkweed and eating it, there's latex inside of the milkweed. As they develop over time to eat that latex, they will become toxic themselves. So they're not a food source for other animals. So they go through 4 instars as they grow. This is towards the end of their instar. This is a large caterpillar before it goes into its chrysalis, and it will use that entire plant as its host. And it's really cool to watch them develop. We collect the monarch caterpillars every year that we find at McConnell Springs, and we'll keep them as a display. Early on, a leaf will last multiple caterpillars, multiple days, but then as they go through instars or changes and grow, one leaf could last for a day for one caterpillar, and they'll eat it very quickly. And you can actually watch them kind of going along. On the bottom side of the leaf of the milkweed, there are little barbs that make it really difficult for a lot of animals to eat that leaf. And a lot of animals can't survive on the toxins that are inside of the leaf. But the monarch is specially adapted to survive on that plant. It's its host plant. So monarch caterpillars will be coming out soon. You'll see them throughout the summer. Good news for monarchs this year, we've actually seen that their populations in Mexico and California that were observed, their numbers have increased. And so this is the first increase that we've seen in several years in that species of population. So we know that some of the work that we're doing for these caterpillars and these butterflies is actually working. So that's really positive. There are lots of programs, Monarch Watch, the Mayor's Monarch Pledge through the National Wildlife Federation, and multiple others that are doing great work to raise awareness for monarch butterflies and to provide milkweed as a host plant. Another interesting pollinator that I always like to show, and this picture is from McConnell Springs. If the photo is not credited, if I forget to mention it, then these photos were taken by staff at McConnell Springs Park in Lexington. This is a clear-winged hummingbird moth. Moths are pollinators that are going to be out mostly at nighttime, but this specific species of moth is actually diurnal, so it's active during the day. They're a really cool little insect. We've been seeing a few around the park actually lately, which is awesome. We've got a few guests that have had sightings of these. If you've never seen one of these flying around, they do move and act just like a hummingbird, but they're a species of moth. So their wings don't beat quite as fast as a hummingbird's, but they are very similar in appearance, and they function very similarly to a hummingbird. So they're collecting nectar from flowers and they're pollinating as they're doing that. This is the caterpillar for the Pandora sphinx moth. Its host plant includes grapevines and honeysuckle. This is one of the many interesting caterpillars that we have locally that you can find right now. So when I mention a host plant, some people may not realize that these insects need specific plants to survive. Now depending on the species of caterpillar, they can have a wide variety of host plants. Some of them are more restrictive. Like I mentioned, the monarch butterfly exclusively uses milkweeds as its host plant, and they need the latex inside of the milkweeds to survive and become toxic to other predators. But some species of caterpillars will have a pretty wide range of host plants that they'll use. One of the host plants, or two of the host plants for this one, would be grapevine and honeysuckle. We've got pretty healthy populations of those. You know, they're looking for native honeysuckles, not non-native honeysuckles, but we've got pretty good varieties of those species here at McConnell Springs and throughout central Kentucky. So there's a pretty good opportunity for this plant or this insect to find its host plant. This is a really, really cool caterpillar. We have a friend locally that collects caterpillars, and she will bring us a few different species that we can put on display at McConnell Springs. This is the hickory horndevil caterpillar. So when it develops, it turns into a moth called the royal moth. It's a very large species of moth itself, but this is actually the largest caterpillar in the moth and butterflies that you'll find in Kentucky. So a good comparison when we're showing this as a display animal is that in its last instar before it goes into its cocoon, this specific caterpillar can be about the size of a hot dog. So if you try to imagine seeing that in the woods and seeing these horns, the spines on the back of it, it's a little intimidating to see it. You can see its host plant that this particular individual was eating at that time is a sumac leaf. So it had a few different species that we could feed it. So we have actually two pollinators in this example. So we have a bee that's going around collecting nectar and pollen from passion flower, and then right beside it is an ant. So the ant is doing the same thing. It's finding food, it's collecting nectar. If you're not familiar with passion flower, it comes out a little bit later in summer. It grows on a vine. It's a very tropical looking flower, wildflower that we have in Kentucky, but it is a native. It's a beautiful flower. It's going to attract many, many, many different pollinators because it's a large flower. It's very bright and vibrant. And so you can see right on top of this particular individual bee, it's got a good collection of pollen that's gathered on the hairs on its body. So as it's going around collecting pollen itself and collecting nectar, it will inadvertently spread pollen from flower to flower, which will fertilize the flower and allow seeds to grow. Like this picture as well. This was taken at McConnell Springs. And so we have a small beetle right at the edge of this phlox. And so the beetle, you can see, has a droplet of nectar that it was collecting. And at the same time as it was moving around, it's helping to move the pollen from flower to flower and allowing that plant to reproduce. There's a couple of species of flower that will try to attract beetles exclusively or crawling insects exclusively. So early in the season, some of our ephemeral wildflowers that will grow will tend to be shorter because there aren't taller plants growing yet. One of my favorites, it's a great ground cover native, is wild ginger. When you spread wild ginger leaves apart, you'll see the flower is actually at the bottom of the plant, really close to the forest floor. And it's a great opportunity for crawling insects like beetles and ants to pollinate that flower. And that's what the flower is trying to attract, is those crawling insects that will be on the forest floor. So now we're kind of moving into a different set of pollinators. So bats, we have several different species of bats identified in Kentucky that are here year round, and they do migrate through. This is, of course, not a picture in Kentucky. This is courtesy of the Bat Conservation International. And this is a bat that's collecting nectar from a cactus flower. So this will be a little bit further away from Kentucky, but bats will still pollinate inadvertently. So we have some flowers that will be out at night blooming, and bats could come to collect nectar, and they can even pass pollen from flower to flower, thus becoming a pollinator. The bats that we have in Kentucky are mostly insect eaters, but if they're collecting insects around flowers, they too can move pollen around. So they are a pollinator. The ruby-throated hummingbird. So hummingbirds are out and about. They're back in the area. They migrate south and then come back. I've heard of a few oddball examples of people being able to provide food for hummingbirds late into the season, but the hummingbirds have to kind of follow the nectar. They have such a high metabolism. They have to follow their food source, and as the flowers go away in the fall and winter time, they definitely have to go along with those. We've seen a few hummingbirds around so far. Of course, they're collecting nectar from flowers and they're moving pollen as they're doing so. Love this picture from McConnell Springs. So American goldfinch, you wouldn't think of them as a pollinator, and I wanted to include them as kind of an accidental pollinator. So they're a seed eater. If you look at their beak, it's designed to crush seeds. So they're going to be eating thistle seeds or small seeds from wildflowers year round. You'll see them at your feeders in the wintertime, and their plumage is a little bit more dull. But these two individuals, the male is up top and the female is a little bit lower there in the picture. They've gone to this flower to collect seeds, but they'll also collect blossoms from flowering plants. And as they're doing so, they can move pollen around and become kind of an accidental pollinator. So some of the benefits of pollinators: 1 out of 3 mouthfuls of food or drink require a pollinator. So think about your lunch today. You may have a protein, a bread, some kind of fruit or vegetable to go along with your lunch. 1 out of those 3 mouthfuls will require a pollinator to produce that food. So if our pollinator populations go down, think about the impact it would have on our food sources. 75% of our flowering plants rely on pollinators to set their seed or fruit. Pollinated crops have a $30 billion annual economic value. Without pollinators, we wouldn't have apples, pears, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, pumpkins, watermelons, and numerous other things that we depend on and enjoy daily. They create healthier plant environments. Many animals rely on fruits and seeds as their food source, and so they're providing those foods for other animals beyond us. And insects are key to our food web. So if they're not even beyond their pollinating effects, they're providing food to other animals as a food source. So why we should be concerned: habitat loss. Like a lot of other animals, they're losing their habitat for foraging, nesting opportunities. They're losing their food sources. And that's, of course, obviously due to land loss because of agricultural purposes and development that people are doing. We've introduced exotic animals into the environment that can cause a lot of issues for our pollinators, that can reduce their habitat space. Of course, climate change, we know, can cause extinction. It can cause a lot of different weather pattern shifts or adjustments that they're not available to acclimate to quickly. If you think about the monarch butterfly, if all their populations are congregated in Mexico and Southern California during the wintertime, if we have these weird weather shifts that could impact those areas, then we could see most of the population wiped out due to impacts from weather in that environment. And then pesticides that are being used can kill pollinators directly, reduce their reproduction ability, and kill the plants that they need to survive. So quickly, with the few minutes I have left, I told Renee I wasn't going to use the whole 20 minutes, and now I'm trying to rush to get it in. I want to go over a few pollinator projects that we're involved with at Lexington Parks, and there's a lot going on. These are honestly mostly projects that I'm involved with, so there's even more going on beyond this. This first image is from a right-of-way project at Masterson Station Park. So if you're familiar with Masterson Station Park, it's off of Leestown Road. It's one of our larger regional parks. It's got our Fayette County Fairgrounds are located there. There's a soccer complex there, and our equestrian programs located there as well. So it's a very large park. But at the front near Leestown Road, there's a gas line right of way, and Columbia Gas, one of our partners, decided to, in an effort to provide habitat and reduce some of their maintenance on the site, they approached Lexington Parks a few years ago about creating pollinator habitat on the site. And so this is a picture that was taken last year on that site. It's a kind of a meandering strip right along Leestown Road. And so it's designed to flower throughout the growing season. So there's a wide variety of flowers there, and it's right over the gas line right away. So you can see it's packed full of flowers at this time. There's a few of our registered monarch way stations throughout Lexington Parks, and there are definitely more than this. This was just kind of a sample. So here at McConnell Springs, our rain garden, which is being extended right now, is a registered way station. Raven Run's Nature Sanctuary Butterfly Garden is a station. Wellington Park, Jacobson Park Playground, Lakeside Golf Course has 10 way stations. I'll shout out our golf courses. We have plenty of habitat space in our golf courses, and our golf managers really focused over the last few years in providing more space for native plants in those locations. Because if you think about a golf course, it's just a big green space, and those roughs that are on the edges of the course really are unused in a lot of spaces. And so it provides a great opportunity for wildflowers. And so they participated in a program called Monarchs on Fairways. And so they've introduced monarch habitat into those locations because it's unused space, and now it's providing habitat, and it's definitely a beautiful addition to those golf courses at Lakeside and even at Kearney Hills Golf Course as well. Other pollinator areas throughout the Parks and Recreation, we have Heisel Farm Park, which has 100+ acres of open prairie, which is managed as prairie habitat for pollinators and animals that depend on that specific habitat. Raven Run Nature Sanctuary, again, has 200+ acres of open prairie that's managed for pollinators. It's managed for other animals as well. Kenilwood Park pollinator plots rolls off the tongue really well. This is a new installation that the Rotary Club of Lexington put in this year, actually, the Masterson Station Park right-of-way. And recently we installed a monarch demonstration garden at Thoroughbred Park. This is another program that we have going on throughout our parks, which is Bring Back the Bluegrass. It's a naturalization effort within Parks and Recreation. Currently, there are 28 parks that have been identified with over 80 acres of land that have been identified as opportunities to reduce mowing practices and introduce different types of native habitat depending on the land. This was identified in our 2018 Parks and Recreation Master Plan by the community. And we're taking those areas, reducing our mowing practices in these in the past, they were unused mowed areas that we were just going out and mowing every 2 weeks, and they weren't really used for any kind of active programming. And we still have a lot of passive space that we do mow in these same parks to allow people the green space to use. But we're trying to introduce habitats here. And those different habitats include forested areas, riparian zones near water, pollinator habitats, and short prairies. You can find more information about Bring Back the Bluegrass at lexingtonky.gov and why we're approaching that program and how we plan to do that in the future. And then what you can do as a citizen, what can you do? If you're in Lexington, you can get involved. We have volunteer opportunities exist year round at Parks and Recreation across the city. You can, if you have a park in your neighborhood and you would like to do a project in your park, you can approach us and we'll try to find a way to work with you and to find funding to do whatever we can to improve whatever you're trying to do there. Even if it's just a cleanup, we can provide the tools and resources for that. We have a program that we're starting this year called Natural Area Stewardship Program, and that's going to provide volunteer training and environmental education training for our volunteers so that they can get out and do programming and volunteer projects throughout our parks to create habitat and improve habitat that we have. And McConnell Springs and Raven Run have regular volunteer days monthly. At McConnell Springs, it's the third Saturday of every month. We call it Weekend Workout. Raven Run has their volunteer day the fourth Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. for each location. It's free. You can just show up and we'll have volunteer activities ready to go. Other things you can do that are going to be touched on shortly. You can plant plants at your home for pollinators. You can introduce areas around your home that you mow. So if you have a large piece of property and you're mowing an area that you don't really use, you can look at ways to reduce mowing, even if it's just reducing the amount of time or the frequency in which you mow. You can plant native plants that will be the host plants for caterpillars, and use pesticides wisely. I know pesticides are a useful tool when they're used properly. So you never want to use pesticides during active flowering seasons, and you definitely want to be considerate of when and where you're using those pesticides. So that is all that I have for now. And I apologize if I went a little bit over, Renee.
No, I appreciate that. You know, one thing I failed to mention is that this is Pollinator Week, right?
It is. Yeah, that was something I should have mentioned as well. So we're in Pollinator Week right now. Pollinator Week is an annual program that was designed to raise awareness for pollinators. Actually, Mayor Gordon has designated this week. She recognized it through a proclamation as Pollinator Awareness Week in Lexington. So through our Mayor's Monarch Pledge program that she has committed to annually for the past few years, that's one of our action items, is to make a proclamation recognizing monarch butterflies and pollinators for their significance. And we have a few other projects that we're working on right now. So we have some education programs that we're going to be doing to go along with Pollinator Awareness Week here at McConnell Springs and at Raven Run. We just wrapped up an art project for kids, an art contest for Pollinator Awareness Week. And so we're going to be doing the judging for that in the next couple of weeks and kind of have the art projects on display at McConnell Springs and Raven Run.
Wonderful. So it sounds like there's a lot of good things going on to help pollinators.
There are, and that's just barely scratching the surface. That's just the things that I'm doing here. We have a great community that's been involved with a lot of different projects, and so it's branching well beyond Lexington Parks and Recreation. But we try to be involved and be a good supportive partner as much as possible.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you being on our show today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. So, moving on from the pollinators, now we're actually going to say, okay, what kind of native plants can you plant to attract some of those pollinators? So we have Susan Fox, if you don't mind turning on your camera.
We go.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. And she's going to give us a presentation on native plants. And you have a lot of good choices, looks like.
There are many. Not all native plants provide a lot of pollen and nectar, but the majority do. A lot of good choices out there.
Wonderful.
You ready for me to share?
Go ahead and start.
Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, good deal. All right. So with native plants, there's three things you want to look at in particular. One of them is to have a large block of color if you can, to attract pollinators. Also to try and have nectar and pollen all season long, because most of these will feed all season. And then to try and have habitat and layers and leaves materials for overwintering. There's quite a few that will either overwinter in leaf litter or in stems. And so your garden may not be quite as neat if you're trying to encourage pollinators. So Dr. Dan Potter shared a couple of his slides with me, and they have done some studies over 3 years on what pollinators are feeding on which plants. And one of the things that we know and they've shown is that the flower form matters. And so an open flower, the pollinators can feed on, and when they have lots of petals, or as in the hybrid tea rose, or a lot of sterile flowers like in that hydrangea, then that's not going to be such a good plant for a pollinator. And this is just another slide he shared with me, and it shows the bees that they collected off that flowering crabapple and off the deutzia. And it just shows that you may not see them all at any one time, but there can be a lot of different bees feeding on a plant, and different plants will attract different species of bees and other pollinators, beetles and flies and butterflies. So in general, native plants are considered to be plants that were here at the beginning of European settlement, and they've evolved to have complex relationships with insects, animals, fungi. It depends on the person, but at least within 100-mile distance is considered to be native to that area. And when you're planting them, it's always good to look at what the plant requirements are and what kind of soils and conditions you have, and try and match those up. And then also to look at that mature size, because I myself have had to move things because I didn't look at mature size closely enough, and they get out of hand. So I'm going to start with the lowest ones first, and with some ground covers. Carolina pink is a nice ground cover that blooms in the spring and can take dry to medium soils. It attracts butterflies, native bees, hummingbirds. It does not tolerate wet soils. It has an interesting thing that it's sticky on its calyx to deter ants from stealing nectar. And it's also semi-evergreen, which is nice. Moss phlox is just a common one, but guess what? It's native. So you can plant all the moss phlox you want, and it's semi-evergreen, and it really looks nice when it's drooping over something, a rock wall, that type of thing. It's very pretty. And it supports butterflies and sphinx moths. It's an early spring bloomer, so it's an important source of nectar in the spring. Wild strawberries, and this is my dog Brown modeling for you. He thinks it's very comfortable to sit in there. is a fairly aggressive spreader. It is a native and it supports bees, butterflies, and skippers. And we were discussing before we got started, I have never tasted one of these wild strawberries. There are critters or whatever that eat them all. So I never, I just don't even hardly see them when they're red, but you can see them blooming there in the background. It is pretty aggressive and can cover things. So you want to choose a site carefully where you plant this. And the deer do graze on it. They've not killed it, but sometimes they graze it down pretty close. This one is a really nice one, Rose Vervain or Verbena. We like it. It does prefer full sun. It doesn't do as well in shade, but it's a fairly long-lived, well, it's a short-lived perennial, but I've had one for several years and it forms a nice colony and it really blooms for a long time. It's actually one of my earliest bloomers in the spring and it blooms on into the summer. So supports the long-tongued bees, the butterflies, and the hummingbirds. So that's a really nice ground cover. And then we can't forget our grasses and sedges because many of the pollinators will either feed on grass pollens or use them as a host for their larvae. And some of them might overwinter in the stems. So you need to include grasses and sedges as part of your planting to have the whole package for pollinators. And I don't know if you can, I haven't turned it on. That upper right corner is the pink muley grass, which is really a cool one. It looks like a big spray of pink. Northern sea oats, which is on the lower right, is another one I love, but it's fairly aggressive. So I would keep it in a naturalized area. If you plant it in a formal flower bed, you're going to have it popping up here, there, and everywhere. But the spangles of the seed heads are really pretty. The bottle brush grass, which is the seed heads in the middle on the bottom there, I see it at LBL, and it's hard to get a really good picture of it, but it's a very interesting grass, the seed head is. And then purple love grass and prairie drop grass are just, nice grasses for ground covers. The little blue stem and the big blue stem have some fall color that's really nice. And some of the big blue stems and the bigger grasses are needed if you establish a tall prairie to hold up some of the tall flowers that grow in prairies like compass plant. They require some support. So here's a picture of a Pennsylvania sedge, which is one of the few sedges that takes drier soils. And you can see it has a very nice mounding form. It's a great ground cover as well. And that's going to provide pollen for pollinators. And there are 36 species of caterpillars that will utilize this sedge. So moving into herbaceous plants, I don't have too many shade plants on here because there's just not enough time. But columbine is a good one that's deer resistant and good for naturalized areas and can reseed. And it will attract the hummingbirds, bumblebees, other smaller bees and moths. It does take light shade, part shade to light shade. The penstemons, calico is one, this is one that I have at home. And it really is a fairly attractive plant that will draw long-tongued bees and some hummingbirds and butterflies. It has some of the penstemons have a fairly high nectar content. It can be 37% sugar. So actually I would call that more of a spring bloomer because mine's already bloomed early summer. But a nice plant, and there's other penstemons that are native. I have slender penstemon that grows up and down my road with a white flower. It's not quite as showy as this one, but there are several out there that you can look at for your garden. This one is probably not great for pollinators. This is a hummingbird plant, but everybody loves Indian pinks. It does grow wild in my area up and down the roads. And it can take a fair amount of sun. Mine is only getting late afternoon shade and doing very well. And it's a great hummingbird plants. They are the pollinators for this plant. You can deadhead it and prolong the bloom on it if you want to. It's hard to collect the seeds on it because it throws the seeds out when they get dry. So if you want to collect seeds, you have to bag it and capture them. Coreopsis, there's annual and perennial Coreopsis. They will have a prolonged bloom if you deadhead them. They're hosts for butterflies and pollen collectors. This one is a great honey plant, the giant hyssop or the anise hyssop. Butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds will use this. The giant one, they call it the hummingbird hyssop. And they have a very high nectar content, 40% sugar, and can make a great honey with a slight mint flavor. And it's resistant to granulation, which is a nice characteristic of honey. The narrow-leaf sneezeweed is, it's a good pollen plant and nectar plant, but it has a bitter honey, and it's not one that we would want to eat. It's good for overwintering hives that blooms in the summer and fall. Takes a moister soil. And jewelweed, I probably should have taken this one out of here. This is one that grows in the shade. It is good for long-tongued bees and hummingbirds in the summertime. It's kind of a neat plant. I just like them. I like seeing them. And of course, you know, the seeds, if you roll them in your fingers, they spring out, which is fun for kids. Spotted bee balm is an excellent honey producer and is host to Carner blue butterfly, and bumblebees, and some moths use it as a host plant. So that's an excellent one to plant. Allegheny monkey flower is resistant to deer, tolerates wet soils, good for naturalized areas, and it's a butterfly host plant for common buckeye and Baltimore checker spot. These are just everywhere right now. The black-eyed Susan, brown-eyed Susan, and orange coneflower are blooming. Black-eyed Susan is considered to be the most aggressive, and brown-eyed Susan is a little bit more restrained, but these are all good plants. They can make a dark amber honey, and the nectar is reported at around 32% sugar for some of them. So those are great to include if you want to do them in a more formal setting, a mass setting, or you could include them in a prairie if you want to have a pollinator patch. Cardinal flower is great for hummingbirds, but it takes a moist soil. Coreopsis is another native that's easy to come by, is drought tolerant. There's 80 different species, deer resistant, provides pollen. Great blue lobelia, hummingbirds will utilize, long-tongued bees, bumblebees, and it does need a wet to moist soil again, like the cardinal flower. This one is a great honey producer, mountain mint, and is great for bees and beneficial wasps, small butterflies. It gets about 4 feet tall. Garden phlox is common. That's a native, attracts butterflies, skippers, and moths. Some powdery mildew is occasionally a problem, but it also has a great fragrance. And the milkweeds, I think I'm getting run out of time. I won't even get close to through all these, but milkweeds are great for pollinators. There are several varieties. The common one is the most aggressive, but you can plant butterfly milkweed, swamp or rose milkweed. And the one in the lower right that has the great spangled fritillary on it is a purple milkweed, which is less common, but I think it's going to be coming on the market. And that one is actually one that I dug out of a ditch and I'm trying to propagate it. They do require cross pollination, so it's a little bit hard to propagate it when they're scarce. The sugar content for some milkweeds is 37% in the nectar. It's a nice white, mild flavored honey. Blazing star or liatris are, I see that they're more in the fall, and driving down the road going through LBL, I've seen them covered in butterflies and pulled over to look and see what that plant was, and it was a liatris. So there are several species of those that are good for bees, butterflies, skippers, and moths. Obedient plant is a neat plant that will attract the bumblebees, the hummingbirds, and long and short-tongued bees. It can be a little aggressive as a spreader in the garden, particularly in a rich site. So good to include, but be careful where you put it, but you can control it. Blue stars are really neat. They host bees, wasps, and beetles, and you have that blue flower in the spring, and then the Hebrichtii gets that kind of neat yellow orange color in the fall, which is pretty spectacular. Blue false indigo baptisias are some of my favorites. It really makes, it's not a bush, it's not a shrub, but it has that bush shape, and it can get as big as 5 feet tall, and it's very rounded. Puts out those beautiful flowers in the spring that are pea-like. It is a legume. And then it has those pods on it that are interesting in the fall also. They can be very long lived. I think it's 50 years that a baptisia can live. Coneflowers are wonderful in meadows and prairies or as specimen plants, and they host the silvery checker spot. Their long-tongued bees, butterflies, and skippers feed on them. Birds feed on the seeds. So just a great plant. There's so many different coneflowers and with different shapes, and I kind of love them all. This rattlesnake master is just an interesting one. It takes wet to dry soils, and it's a prairie plant, believe it or not. But it hosts small sweat bees and flies, beneficial wasps, wood nesting bees. The wood nesting bees will bore into the stalks of some of these and either put their, especially the dead stalks, and they'll put their larvae in there, or they'll overwinter. It actually does make a nice honey that's a dark color, has a good flavor. And that on the bottom should have been taken off. I lost a whole set of slides. I didn't get it saved and I had to redo it. So I've got some mistakes in here. I apologize for those. Yellow coneflower is another coneflower that's really pretty that the goldfinch will eat and supports a lot of different pollinators, and the silvery checker spot butterfly. Then if you want to get into the tall prairie plants, the rosin weeds can get 10 feet tall, but they're in a prairie setting, they're pretty spectacular. The cup flower holds water in the leaves, and birds and frogs will use that water that's held at the base of the leaves in the cup, but it can be an aggressive spreader, so you have to be careful where you put it. The compass plant is a little bit more easy to work with, and it's called a compass plant because the leaves will turn north-south, and so you can tell which direction is north and south. We already did sneezeweed. Scarlet bee balm is another great one that's blooming right now, and I've had the clear-winged sphinx moth on my bergamot at home. So the scarlet bergamot attracts hummingbirds, which see red, and of course bees and other insects don't see red. So that red color to a bumblebee is just going to look black, and they're not as likely to get the nectar from it. But the hummingbirds do see red and will be very attracted to that scarlet bee balm. These are somewhat subject to powdery mildew, which can be a problem, a little bit of a problem. It doesn't kill them. These do very well in the garden. I have some, and some they'll self-seed and spread themselves a little bit. It's not bad. Royal catchfly is just a beautiful plant that attracts butterflies and hummingbirds. It's a very showy flower. It gets 2 to 3 feet tall. And so anyway, that's just a lovely one to have in the garden as a specimen plant or in a prairie, in a meadow. There are some sunflowers also, which produce nectar for bees and butterflies and pollen, and then a heavy seed crop for the birds. Their nectar share can be 31 to 49%. And then in the fall, I'll do the fall ones and I'll wrap it up. The asters are pretty critical. They provide a lot of pollen that the pollinators store for the winter. And the goldenrods do as well. Plus, they can make a pretty good, a lot of sugar off the goldenrods, but it does not have a good flavor. It granulates well, or it's a smelly honey. So most of the honey that's made off of this plant is used to overwinter the bees. But if you have this in your garden, you will see tons of pollinators on it in the fall. And you probably want to avoid the common goldenrod because it's a fairly aggressive spreader unless you have it in a meadow setting. I can stop here. I can go on. There are a couple of them, the ironweed and the common milkweed. If you're around farms and pastures, you probably don't want to plant them. Your farmer neighbors might not appreciate it because it spreads into their pastures and it's a little bit hard to control. So that's a consideration just as a good neighbor to avoid a plant that might be aggressive in spreading into pastures that are used by cows.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I've been sitting here writing down all these different ones that I want to go. We greatly appreciate you doing this. And, it being Pollinator Week, this actually worked out great. And I think, this could go for a variety of different things, whether you have, just want to plant a couple, or if you want, a whole field full. So it just depends on what your objectives are.
I see our pollinator, our native plant sale went very well this year, and we really could have doubled or tripled what we sold. So I think there's a huge interest in planting native plants right now.
Is there a specific time of year that works better to plant native plants, or does it depend on the plant?
It probably depends on the plant, but spring is when most of them are available. Some of the perennials you can plant in the fall.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. And I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you, Renee.
All right. So coming up next, we have Kai Davis. He is a grad student here in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and we greatly appreciate you being here.
I'm glad to be here again.
So we've had a lot of requests for your bird calls, and so we brought you back on for you to do a few for us.
All right, yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen. Welcome to Wildlife Sounds again. All right, so yeah, we are doing birds. So today we are doing, if you all were here last time, today is gonna be a red day. So I do color themed days. And last time was blue, and we talked about blue jay and cerulean warbler. Today is going to be a red day. So this one is the first one. All right, so yeah, that's the sound that this bird will make. This is typically the habitat that you might find them in, although they're pretty widespread, so you can find them in a lot of different places in the US. So this bird is the cardinal. So the cardinal is going to make a variety of different calls. Primarily, you hear that cheer, 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 or purdy, 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 purdy. And sometimes people say that they sound like lasers, like little laser guns shooting. So if you ever hear that, so that's the little laser, that toot, 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 toot. So if you ever hear that and you're in the city or in some type of fragmented forest, this will probably be what you're hearing. So let's learn some more about the cardinal. So within their life history and behavior, so their crest, what's on the top of their head, their feathers, that's what is going to be used to display their behavior, how they're feeling. So if it's up more, it's going to be showing that they're agitated or stressed. If it's down, they're probably more comfortable in their situation. The males, they will sing to defend their nesting territory and actively attack intruding males. So a lot of times cardinals can be quite aggressive towards each other and other birds. And in springtime, the singing that you'll hear is mainly courtship. So for the males and females singing. So for their diet, primarily seeds and fruits. However, they also eat some insects as well. So some fruits may include, and seeds, dogwood, wild grape, buckwheat, grasses, sedges, some of the things that you may have heard before I came on too. And then for insects, they eat like cicadas, flies, centipedes, spiders, all those things, and even snails actually. So that's kind of interesting. So for their habitat and location, you'll typically find them throughout the eastern US in this blue range. Which is baffling because they're so common in the eastern US. You could go outside right now and you'd probably run into a couple, but it's not a thing in the western US. So people from out west will come out here and be like, oh my gosh, a cardinal, I've never seen one. But it's wild to think that they aren't so commonplace in other places. So they typically are found in dense shrubby areas or forest edges, overgrown fields, backyards, marshy thickets, and regrowing forests, so all over. And then the growth of towns and suburbs across the eastern US has helped the cardinal expand their range, especially more northward. So going into conservation and threats. So kind of with what I said, they're so commonplace. So they're not really of concern. So that's a good thing that we don't have to worry about with these birds. And then the expansion of agricultural and suburban habitat over the past 2 centuries has increased their population and helped stabilize their population. So they have a population of about 130 million globally. So not much of conservation concern. So lastly, some fun facts. So they're one of our most popular birds, especially in the US, and it's the official state bird of 7 eastern states, including Kentucky. And then they are also the mascot of the greatest team ever. I'll let you all figure out which one I'm talking about. Some of you may know my allegiances, but I do go to UK. I'll give that a hint. There are only a few female Northern American songbirds that do sing, and cardinals are one that have singing female songbirds. So it's really interesting. So on to the next one as I check the chat. Why has a cardinal been banging on my window at sunup for the past 2 months? Okay, so it's probably because they are quite aggressive. Maybe it sees its reflection and it's thinking that it's another cardinal encroaching on its territory, or maybe it's just super curious of why this barrier is here and it can't pass through. So who knows, but those are probably 2 likely scenarios. But they are most active at sunrise and sunset. Sunrise, you'll hear them all the time, just calling and singing and singing. So on to the next one. And yes, if you have any questions or want to guess what bird it is, feel free to put it in the chat. So here we go. All right, there we go. So yeah, this is the habitat that you would probably find this bird in. So it's kind of that chickbird and then that singing song. So this bird is the scarlet tanager, the very elusive scarlet tanager, I will say. So this song can be described as like a hurried burry, a repetitive warbler. And it's somewhat similar to a robin. It's very similar to a robin, but they say it's a robin call with like a sore throat. So it's more like, so like nasally. And then you hear that chick burr, and then it goes into the like robin call. So I actually got really excited when I was doing field work because I thought I heard one and then realized it was just a robin calling. So that was kind of unfortunate. But yeah, very similar to that. So let's learn some more about the scarlet tanager. So with this life history and behavior, so they're monogamous when it comes to breeding, but they may switch mates from year to year, which is really interesting. They also are fairly common in oak forests in the summer, but they remain like up in the canopies for the most part. So they're really hard to see and find. So if you're ever trying to go find some, it can be quite difficult. But then sometimes in like the early spring when it's still like kind of cold out, because they eat insects, and I'll talk about that in a second. So they might come out of the canopy to look for insects lower. But this late in the summer, it could be really hard or this late in the spring, now that it is summer, it'll be really hard to find them. They'll be very high up in the canopy. And then the females also are kind of a yellowish green color too. So not this scarlet red color. I should have added a picture, but yeah, so that's kind of interesting. So going into the diet, like I said, they eat mainly insects, but they may also eat some fruit or tender buds. So they may eat dragonflies, grasshoppers, termites, butterflies, moths, all the above. And they can even catch flying insects like bees and wasps and hornets from the air. So it's kind of cool. So with their habitat and migration, so let's talk about their habitat first. So they breed in mature deciduous forests, mixed deciduous coniferous forests. They prefer large forest tracts with large trees, interior forest species, so not so much on the edge. So you won't necessarily find them in the same places you would find cardinals. And if you're going out in the city, it's not likely that you'll really run into one unless it's kind of a more mature growth wherever you're finding yourself in. And then in terms of migration, like I kind of showed a little bit, so the red is going to be their breeding grounds. So right in Kentucky, so right where we are, I think right here is going to be Lexington. So we're right in their breeding grounds. So that's really cool. The yellow is their migration. So where they're traveling to the breeding grounds or from to their wintering grounds down here. So this is where they winter. So once it gets cold up here, they travel all the way down here and stay there for the winter and then back. So they're long distance migrants, evidently. So twice a year. So they fly up once and then fly down once through the Gulf of Mexico. They usually migrate at night as well. And so, yeah, that's the migration for this bird. All right. So in terms of conservation and threats, the populations have been relatively steady from 1966 to 2019. Global breeding population of 2.6 million, so not as much as the cardinal. So they are of relatively low conservation concern as well, although they are vulnerable to loss of habitat in their wintering areas as well as their breeding areas here. Some threats might be wildfires, spring heat waves, heavy rainfall, and then urbanization. Even parasitation by cowbirds that use their nests and put their own eggs in their nests and raise their young are raised by that. So that can also be a threat as well, especially coming from these birds being found in forest edges as opposed to their interior forest that they would much prefer. So to safeguard the scarlet tanager population, preserving and restoring mature forest habitats for breeding, migrating, and wintering is recommended. So that's kind of the conservation and threats that this bird is facing. However, like I said, it's still relatively low conservation concern. And lastly, some fun facts for you. So a group of tanagers are collectively known as a season of tanagers. So a little fun fact for some trivia, if you are to do that ever, that's a season. So a bunch of tanagers are called a season of tanagers. And then they also help control pests by eating them. So I very much appreciate that because I'm not one for animals with more than 4 legs. So I like scarlet tanagers for that reason particularly. So that is wildlife sounds for today with the 2 red birds. So cardinal and scarlet tanager. So I hope you all enjoyed it.
It was a great presentation. So, and I know we'll have you on again before you get back into the swing of things with the UK year. And so, yeah. But we thank you for joining us today and doing some presentations on those birds. Yeah. Look forward to seeing what in a couple of weeks, what color is the birds.
yeah, we'll have to see. Maybe I'll do a little multicolored thing.
There you go. That'll be awesome. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So, that's all we have for today, and we greatly appreciate it. And remember, if you want to see any of our show topics or anything that any topic that we've just talked about on today's show or any of the past 100 shows that we've done, you can go to fromthewoodstoday.com and see all of those. You can you can binge watch us if you'd like. We have over 100 hours of content on there, so you'll be able to do that and at your leisure, and you can what did he say? What bird was that? You can go back and look at it. But we greatly appreciate you joining us. And that's all we have for today. So we will see you next week at 11 o'clock. Take care. Bye.
From the woods today.